Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us. For today's show, CBS Sports has put out their annual coach rankings. We're going to talk about them a bit and get into roughly 5 coaches who the new CFP will either help or hurt going forward. But before we dive in, let me remind you that you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. If you can, take a second to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you hear us. We always appreciate that. So it's been about 10 years or so that CBS Sports has been putting together their annual coaching rankings. And they do it kind of right now after all the spring games are over. They have a group of panelists from CBS Sports, 247 Sports. They kind of submit ballots. They're compiled sort of like a top 25 poll. They rank the P4 coaches, used to be P5 coaches. So you're not going to find Jamie Chadwell, Jason Candle, Jeff Traylor, John Summerall, Troy Calhoun, etc. We're talking about guys in the P4. There is no set guideline to how folks could create their ballots. So some were ranking like they were going to be potentially hiring a head coach as an AD. Some were looking at recruiting and development. Some more about who can master the transfer portal. And, there's also the balance of, do you value a CEO head coach, or are you looking for someone who's a good in-game coach, play caller? There's a lot of factors to this. And maybe if you like or don't like Deion Sanders as a person, I'm not sure. I'm not going to say that, but I always wonder how much of that kind of goes into it. So, Sean, when you were doing your own, because I know you had your own ballot and all of this, how is your approach to kind of ranking coaches?
Yeah, I think that for me, you have to look at the body of work, certainly. Like, I'm not just going to eliminate what some of these coaches have accomplished over the years, but there is a recency bias to it, and there should be. Right? Like you don't want to just say, well, Mac Brown won a championship in 2005 and therefore he should be number 3, right? Like that's not a serious way to approach this. So I think that you look both in the context of what they are right now, what they were very recently, and also try to project them forward just a little bit. Now, that leads to some very different results among people. And I'll tell you what, one of the things is we have a team of people put this together, and not everybody has the same criteria on how they want to approach it. So, for example, I look at, just to go through our top 5 real quick. Number 1, Kirby Smart. Hey, guess what? Think that's a pretty solid number 1. I think that wasn't very controversial. That doesn't last very long. Number 2, Ryan Day. Number 3, Dabo Swinney. Number 4, Brian Kelly. Okay. Number 5, Steve Sarkisian. I'll tell you right now, that is not what my top 5 looked like exactly, right? Mine looked a little different. Just to go through mine actually real quick. Yeah, number 1, Kirby Smart, easy enough. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. I think that there is no consensus number 2 at the moment. I decided to go with Kalen DeBoer at number 2. Just led Washington to a national championship game, taking over an Alabama program where you should be able to accomplish even more. This is more of a buy low pick, and I think it'll age well than it is necessarily like that he's outdone whatever people. But I had him number 2. And just to say, I understand, of course, why people have Steve Sarkisian sort of really, really high, like in the top 5 level. I had him number 9 on mine, which I think is very good. Like being the number 9 coach in the country is very good. I want to be clear. Kalen DeBoer beat him twice at a quote-unquote lesser program, built a team that was better than his team in less time. Like, I don't know why exactly sort of there's this idea that, well, Steve Sarkisian built this one thing and therefore should be top 3 or 4 versus Kalen DeBoer while he's stepping into a new thing. And I know that recruiting is a part of it. And by the way, one person who I'm sure impacted these rankings a little bit was my colleague Bud Elliott, who is over at 247 Sports. He's huge into the recruiting game. And on the further end of things, I had Deion Sanders, just to talk about him, right? I had him in the low 50s. Let me see. I had him at 56, right? So not great, but also this is a coach who's won 2 SWAC championships. This is a coach who very much was on track, going from 1-11 to 4-8. And I know that there were people on my team who probably had him last, right? Or very close to last because they don't like his
based on the
approach.
rankings, they must have, because it's fascinating. He was ranked number 61 and one of the bottom of the the P4 rankings here. And just for perspective, Kalen DeBoer was not, you have him number 2, he was number 7 when they kind of tallied all of the ballots together.
Which, like, nothing outrageous, certainly, but it's just lower than I would have had him. Number 3, I went with Kyle Whittingham at Utah. I think that you look at his last couple of years, it's been pretty incredible. Number 4, I went with Brian Kelly. That's another body of work type thing, right? Where he's led a team to multiple playoffs. He's led a team to a national championship game. They win the SEC or the SEC West in his first year. And last year was not very good, to be clear, but this isn't a 1-year evaluation. Number 5, I zagged a little bit. I went with Chris Kleiman at Kansas State. I think that the work that he's doing is pretty unbelievable, to be honest. And the level that he's risen the program to and winning the Big 12. And just to remind people, in 2022, they would have had a bye in the college football playoff. Maybe we'll get back to that in just a second. So I had Ryan Day 6, I had Dabo Swinney 7. Still, again, very high. I want to be clear. Like, these are some of the best coaches in college football and being evaluated as such. I was personally surprised to see Dabo Swinney end up at number 3 and Ryan Day at number 2. This, I think, gets back to look, Dabo Swinney's won 2 national championships. From an accomplishment perspective, like if we're ranking the greatest coaches in college football right now, sure, I think Dabo is number 2. But that's not really what we're asking right now. We're asking for a snapshot in time and a projection forward. And, so Dabo Swinney at 3, Ryan Day at 2. That was a little surprising to me, but I think especially from a Day perspective, the talent acquisition piece is very valuable to people. The fact that he's able to put together these elite rosters, to me, it's equally as relevant that he's put together these elite rosters and lost to worse teams and is 1-6 overall against top 5 opponents. That is not good enough to me when you're the head coach at Ohio State. All this to say, I mean, I think that there's a lot of different ways that you could have evaluated this group, and this is probably the hardest coaches ranking, especially at the top, that I've ever had to do.
Yeah, it seems that way, and it is peculiar when, as you pointed out. Clearly, it's easy to derive what was pushing some of these coaches in the overall ballot listing to where they were. Ryan Day, again, based on talent acquisition, and other than losing a couple of very important games, he seems to be a competent coach overall. And Dabo does feel a little bit more like the past than what we're seeing right now and where we think things are going. And again, he could by all means prove us wrong. I thought Kyle Whittingham was a great call. I think he deserves to be ranked higher. And I think I don't think he cares, but I think he thrives on being that kind of just overlooked just a little bit too much. Even when,
sorry, Kyle, you're not overlooked on this podcast.
Well, and that's the thing. Overall, he's number 6, and even then, I'm kind of I mean, when I was kind of looking at my own thoughts on who benefits the most from the changes, he was definitely one of the ones I thought benefited a lot. It was interesting to also see, where did you have Mike Norvell again? Where did you place him?
I had Mike Norvell at number 11 on my list. So just to round up my top 10, I had Ryan Day at 6, Dabo Swinney at 7, Lincoln Riley at 8. I know why people are selling right now. I think it's a little bit of an overreaction. I put him in a way in that Brian Kelly camp. Steve Sarkisian at 9, reasons that I mentioned, right? I think that the upside is there. I also think it was a little bit so far of a 1-year thing, and I want to see how it continues forward. Lance Leipold at 10, Mike Norvell at 11, Dan Lanning at 12, and then another coach who's going to be talked about pretty high, Lane Kiffin at 13.
So now I've got to ask you some questions. What made you place Leipold so far away from Kleiman? Because they're sure. To me, they're hard to separate. They're very similar in some regards. But how did you differentiate them?
Well, I think from my perspective, Chris Kleiman has had that breakout season, right? Had the sort of win the Big 12 type season. It's just been multiple years. Over the last 3 years, it's 8 wins, 10 wins, 9 wins. If you put aside the pandemic season, he's won 8 every single year that he's been there. So, I mean, I think that just we've seen Kleiman hit the higher end of things. Like I mentioned before, he would have coached a playoff team in 2022 in the expanded playoff. Now, look again, Lance Leipold, it is relevant to me what he did at the Division 3 level. I think that absolutely factors in, and he was one of the great D3 coaches of all time. He turns Buffalo into a winner, and Buffalo is a place where people do not win all that often. And then, of course, taking Kansas the way that he did. I think, let's say that Lance Leipold has another 9-win type season. Let's say he has a 10-win season this year. I think that just further validates, and I think that shoots him maybe even for me into the top 5. But I think that you can also see with my rankings a little bit, I'm a little slower to react, I would say, in either direction. I don't want to, again, like with Steve Sarkisian, he had the breakout season. I think that you also have to look at the rest of his coaching career, though, right? Like, not necessarily the way that USC ended. I don't think that's really all that relevant, but pretty average at Washington. Like, obviously took over a bad program, but was good, not great at Washington. Was a good, at times great, but not consistently great coordinator, I would say. And then the first 2 years at Texas were pretty mediocre. Now, of course, he has the moment to go on the trajectory, but it's still kind of 1 year, right? Like, it's still kind of 1 year you're banking on. Dan Lanning, it's 2 years, but like he hasn't hit that high level as yet that people talk about it. Mike Norvell, it's 1 year at Florida State that he's hitting that high level. So that, I think, to me, I value, I would say, sustained success more than most people. Although I do say that, and I have Kalen DeBoer number 2 on my list.
Well, at the same time, though, Dan Lanning was going to be my next question, and that makes some sense, at least in the logic of how you were kind of creating your ballot. One other coach I should ask about, and this is, where do you put James Franklin, and why did you put James Franklin where you did?
I put him at 16. So at 14, after Lane Kiffin, I had Mike Gundy. 15, I had Kirk Ferentz, 2 coaches who have that sustained level of success. And James Franklin is a very, very good coach. Like, I think that he is undervalued. I think he's underrated right now. Another coach who, by the way, is going to benefit from our conversation that we're soon going to have about the college football playoff. But it's a similar deal, right? 2016, he has the Big Ten title year. And coming off of that season, I think that he's more in the top 10 in this kind of list. It's been very good. I don't think that it's been the level of being great, though, for a little too long for me. And I think that he is also a coach where it's like his program that he's built is a head and shoulders above basically everybody in the Big Ten, except for the 2 programs that can win a national championship. So I think, to me, part of my question as I look at Penn State right now is, are they an awesome team? Which they are. Or is it also just a power vacuum? Is there also just no upper middle class whatsoever in the Big Ten? And he's kind of filling that role in some ways, because there's not really, like, I think about, and Wisconsin's been there for times. Iowa's been there for times, but I don't view Iowa as a program to the same level that I view Penn State as a program, which is part of why I have Kirk Ferentz where he is. I think that that's the hard thing for me. And some of these questions are going to be answered very soon by both the expanded college football playoff and also the expansion of the Big Ten, when, hey, I'll actually get to know, is James Franklin on Lincoln Riley's level or Dan Lanning's level? Because I don't really feel like I know the answer right now.
If Dion wasn't in the picture, who do you think was the hottest, I mean, the most spicy take coach in the ranking? Where do you think you saw there was the most deviation? Was it Lincoln Riley? Was it James Franklin? Who were the coach? Which coach do you think generated the most kind of differentiation in how people viewed them?
That's a really good question. Some of the guys that I mentioned at the top, right? Dabo Swinney, I think just the way that you're evaluating him is a huge part of the question mark. And I don't know that we reached a very popular consensus on how to evaluate him. Matt Rule was somebody who ended up a little lower than I expected at 29. I had him just a bit higher. Let me look where I had him on my list. I had him at 18 on my list, because Temple, he rebuilt from nothing. Baylor, he rebuilt from nothing. But I think ultimately it ended up, he's been successful everywhere that he's been. And I think that you start looking down the list a little bit. I would be curious as well how some of these new coaches were handled. Guys like, especially the ones with some experience, like Sharon Moore, David Braun was somebody who had a year of experience, but as an interim coach, which is a little bit of a different situation. I also think that that you look even down at the way that the bottom three coaches were evaluated. The first year coaches who have never been head coaches, Jeff Lebby, Fran Brown, and Deshaun Foster. Not a surprise to me that they ended up in the bottom three, but I was a little surprised that they were all of the bottom three, that there was like nobody else, like a Ryan Walters getting into that conversation, like a Tony Elliott getting into that conversation, but ultimately those were the bottom three. So again, this is one of the most wide open fields that I think that we've had in a while.
You wrote an interesting article, and I encourage those of you listening to go follow this. We had the college football coach rankings, how each coach in the bottom 10 can elevate their stock. So you took a look at the consensus bottom 10 coaches and tried to figure out how they can improve their standing heading in the next season. Which of those 10 do you think has the best opportunity to elevate their standing heading into the 2024 season? I should, by the way, I apologize. I should go ahead and actually say who those 10
Sure,
are.
sure, sure.
So, starting from the bottom, Deshaun Foster, new coach at UCLA. Fran Brown, new coach at Syracuse. Jeff Lebby, new coach at Mississippi State. Ryan Walters at Purdue. Kenny Dillingham at Arizona State. Clark Lee at Vandy. Tony Elliott at Virginia. Deion Sanders at Colorado. Troy Taylor at Stanford. And Scott Satterfeld at Cincinnati. Sam Pittman missed the cut. I'm actually kind of surprised he didn't get in the bottom. I mean, I don't
He's
know.
11th. He's 11th. He's right next up.
Yeah, he's just one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that's I would not pick Sam Pittman on that list. I'm gonna give you two. One, I think that Deion Sanders again is a little undervalued here, and it makes sense. I think that different people evaluate coaches in different ways, and Deion Sanders doesn't necessarily do some of the basic stuff well, right? Like we don't have a track record of development. We don't have, just things like that. High school recruiting is something that I know to some of my colleagues matters a lot, especially on the 247 side of things. But I mean, look, his record across two stops is good. In his last 2 years at Jackson State, he was 22-4. And with this roster that he's got going forward, I think they have a decent chance to make a bowl game. Now, I don't know if they have a lot more than that in the tank. I don't know if they're gonna like suddenly win 9 games, but I think that if they go 6-6 next year, I mean, then he's probably in the high 40s potentially, and I think that that's a pretty reasonable expectation of him. That's why I had him more in the mid 50s. The new coach who I would mention, I'm excited about Fran Brown. And I'm excited about the offseason that he had. I actually had him a little higher on my list than even a couple of returning coaches, just because of what he's done this offseason in terms of acquiring talent, bringing in Kyle McCord at quarterback, of course, landing Elijah Robinson as his defensive coordinator, the former defensive line coach at Texas A&M, and Fadel Diggs, one of the best players in the portal, comes and joins him on the defensive line. I don't know what the ceiling is, and it might not happen in year one is the piece, right? Like maybe it's going to take some time for him to learn how to be a head coach, but like as much as people kind of feel like Deion Sanders is not doing things the traditional way, like Fran Brown is winning in so many of the traditional ways, in high school recruiting, in the transfer portal, by adding staff, by having good ideas, by taking chances on high upside pieces. I would not be surprised at all. Now, I will say, we talk about Syracuse a little bit. I mean, a couple years ago, right? They were winning 2 or 3 games. They actually made a bowl game last year. So that's a blessing and a curse in evaluation. It's a blessing in that he is not starting from zero. There are talented players on this roster, but also like if they go 5-7, how much does that move people when they went 6-7 the year before that? Now, he might have what I call the Jeff Hafley effect, where the results in year one are actually pretty much the same as the year before that got the previous coach fired, but people just like the vibe of the new guy a little more and treat him like a different level. And I could definitely see that happening in a positive way with Fran Brown.
So does that mean, Jeff, we're going to see Fred Brown in the NFL suddenly abruptly leave the team in the lurch. But
I would not anticipate that.
No. He seems like a good fit over there for sure. Well, when we come back, we'll go ahead and take a look at who we think are the 5 coaches, not necessarily the best 5 and the worst 5 or anything like that, but we're going to kind of look at 5 coaches who we think will be most affected by the great shift that's going to happen to the 12-team college football playoff college football playoff arrangement here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
Okay, so what we thought we'd do next is kind of, again, this is a really interesting exercise, because it's one thing to rank the coaches to how we think they are in their ability to coach and all the various things and all the various factors you can arrange to kind of evaluate that. But instead, now we're going to kind of look through the lens of there's going to be a change in the system. The 12-team playoff, 4 power conferences, there's a lot of things happening right now that are going to put some of the old views, some of the old approaches to coaching and the old expectations we have for them to the test. And we decided to kind of take a look at 5 coaches and not necessarily any particular order, but coaches we thought were going to be affected the most. And I'd be curious to know how you decided to take on who's the first person you have.
Yeah, I decided to group 2 people together because I think that in so many ways these 2 programs are a similar place in their respective conferences. And I mentioned one of them before, and that's James Franklin at Penn State, but I'm also going to include Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss. And here's how I kind of view them as similar, right? They are both coaches who have had consistent success, never really had top level success at their programs, but it's because they have such obvious issues in front of them. You know, if you're Lane Kiffin, you're playing Alabama and Nick Saban every single year. You're having to go through Georgia to make the college football playoff. That's not realistic. And if you're Penn State, you're like, well, I had Ohio State and Michigan in my own division. And how am I supposed to get past those 2? And we even saw, to an extent with Michigan, it was like, well, to get past Ohio State, we have to literally build a team good enough to win the national championship. That's the level that it takes. And certainly that's not the expectation for every single coach. But now in the 12-team playoff, that's off the table. There are no roadblocks that these coaches have to get through. They can go around them to make the college football playoff. Even if you lose these games, you're still going to be in the 12-team college football playoff. And suddenly, you can end up in a world where you're the 8th seed heading into the college football playoff or whatever, and you have expectations to win some games, to pull some upsets, to actually go head-to-head, not just against the top 3 or 4 programs in the sport, but some that should be more manageable for your matchups, right? Like, if Lane Kiffin goes into this college football playoff and loses in round 2 to Kansas State, I don't think that people are going to be quite as excited about that, right? If James Franklin goes into this playoff and Louisville upsets them, like I don't think that people are going to be okay with that anymore. Now, the flip side of that is if they go into the playoff and they go 3 rounds deep until they reach the teams that are legitimately going to win the national championship, I think people are like, okay, well, you proved it. You are a top 10 level coach. You're not necessarily, building Ohio State or Georgia, but that's not really the bar when you're the head coach at Ole Miss or Penn State. So I think that it has a chance to be a real double-edged sword for both of these coaches who have found a level of comfort in the upper middle class of both of their conferences. Mm-hmm. And that is going to be put on full display right now.
Yeah, I also kind of pulled them and a few other coaches together, and I kind of call this class the harder than it looks crowd, in the sense that they've been doing pretty well and they have talent and no one's doubting their coaching acumen. But if I'm thinking about how I think the 12-team playoff is going to affect them, I actually found myself realizing there's a parallel track here. The super conference era, everyone's a lot bigger now. And suddenly there's going to be a bigger group of people that just will not be at the top because there's more competition. And the more I thought about James Franklin, the more I actually pushed him as someone who might actually get hurt by the expanded playoff era. Mm-hmm. Not just the playoff, but because his conference is expanded. Because it's not like Ohio State and Michigan are going away. Ohio State's certainly not going away. Michigan might be a little weaker, but then you get Oregon. And Oregon looks like they're going to be a serious contender for being, if not the second, but perhaps the third best team in the league, depending on where Michigan lies. And then what if USC suddenly gets it together? What if Lincoln Riley's defense comes together? Washington, we're still kind of seeing how Jed Fish has got them together. Suddenly, and again, it was interesting to hear the rankings where you had Kirk Ferentz next to James Franklin. What if Kirk Ferentz's offense starts to show at least some decent signs of life? The
Well, what if
reverse
pigs fly?
Lane
You
Kiffin.
never know.
I mean, the reverse Lane Kiffin, the reverse Lincoln Riley. So, I mean, all of these factors make me wonder, is James Franklin going to suddenly get the chance where in previous years, this would have been perfect had the Big Ten stayed where it was? But with all of these new teams and losing the divisions where suddenly you're going to have a bunch of teams that might suddenly surprise us. Wisconsin's another team I should throw out there. Who knows if they get it together and they're one of the top 3 teams in the Big Ten. I think he could be in an awkward position where even though the Big Ten should consistently get 3 and possibly even 4 teams into the playoff, Penn State might not be it. And if that happens 1 or 2 years in a row or 2 out of 3 years, I could see a lot of difficulty arising there that would have surprised a lot of people, quite frankly. But when I looked at who he's up against, when I looked at the competition in the Big Ten, I actually thought this might be a situation that could hurt James Franklin in the long run.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Let me move to my number 2, which is a coach who I think could improve their profile through the playoff. And again, I mentioned him in my top 5, Chris Kleiman. I think that one question that will be interesting. I wrote a piece a few weeks ago about, Kirby Smart is consensus number 1. There's no question about it. Who are the guys who have a chance to knock off Kirby as the number 1 coach in college football? And I brought up the question, do you need to win a national championship to be a potential number 1 coach? I think the answer is yes. But I think that there's also more avenues to reaching maybe that top 3 to 5 than there have been in previous years. So when I look at Chris Kleiman, and let's take, for example, like the NCAA basketball tournament. If you make an Elite 8, that is considered an accomplishment. That's considered achieving something. You don't just have to win the national championship. If you make the Final Four, that's considered a huge accomplishment. Well, what if Chris Kleiman is making the playoff like every other year at Kansas State? If he's winning, 30% of Big 12 championships, but also is making it as an at-large very consistently. I think that that's a pathway to being considered one of the elite level coaches in college football. In the way maybe to make a comparison of like back in the 2000s, Chris Peterson and Gary Patterson were able to establish themselves as elite level coaches before a playoff, of course, but because we were able to see like, hey, they finished top 5 in the country. They finished among the best teams in the entire country, not just for their level, but overall. And so if you're Chris Kleiman, I think that if you have a chance to be there, or at least in the conversation every single week, I mean, what other programs are going to be like that, right? It's going to be Ohio State. It's going to be Georgia. It's going to be Michigan. It's going to be, these elite level programs. And then throw Kansas State into the mix. I think that changes the way that you're talked about in a significant way.
I like that pick, and I had him categorized as coaches that I thought were built for this. The system is built for their kind of level and where their school is. And, it's interesting when you're drawing a comparison. You could draw that comparison to his predecessor, Bill Snyder, the guy who made K-State football, because there was that whole era between like 95 and 2003 where K-State was always in the picture. They were always part of the national conversation. Would they make it in? I mean, remember, they had to change the BCS rules because they got hosed one year in 98 because they lost the Big 12 title game and got sent to the Alamo Bowl rather than what should have been.
Michael Bishop deserved better, man. He deserved better.
But, going over to a similar coach to kind of complement that would be Kyle Whittingham. And it's funny, they're both Big 12 coaches when we think about it. And it was interesting, too, when I was thinking about which – because I was trying to look at if I could pull coaches from all the different P4 conferences. And the only reason Mike Gundy, I didn't put him up there is only because, frankly, I also wonder how long he's going to be there anymore. I mean, how long does he plan to coach? He seems like a guy who enjoys life, and he doesn't look like his entire life surrounds coaching. I could see him one day just going like, all right, I've enjoyed this enough. I'm ready to go kind of do my thing. But with Kyle Whittingham, he just seems like a guy who is going to be at Utah. He is Utah. And he's a guy who could easily win the conference again and again, or at the very least be in the conference title game year after year. And this is a system where it would benefit him. And potentially being a high-ranked Utah team that might lose a conference title game and get that at-large bid that could be available to the Big 12 and the ACC out there as they kind of try to angle more than one team into the playoff each year. I think Whittingham is absolutely – he's a great coach, as you've acknowledged. And he's someone who could climb into that top 5 for a unanimous pick, just in terms of his ability to take advantage of this playoff system and coach teams that win the Big 12. Maybe that's it. Maybe we're talking about the future is going to be K-State and Utah fighting their way into the playoff year after year because of these two guys at the helm. I thought that was a great selection. Who do you have next?
Yeah, and I'll just wrap up the, I guess, Big 12 portion of the program with this. I think that when you look at, so let's group those three together, right? Whittingham, Kleiman, and Gundy. I think that the reason that I picked Kleiman out of that group, he's a little younger than Whittingham. That is part of it. Mm-hmm. But I think that when you look at Kansas State and Kleiman too, they're the one who I feel like is really ascending. Like, they're the one who I think they're using that 2022 season. The next year they get Avery Johnson at quarterback. The next year they bring in Dylan Edwards as a transfer, another great player from the state of Kansas. They're like the one who I feel like is fundamentally changing in a positive way right now, whereas like Utah's already there. That's like, they're already what they are and are going to be. They're already that elite type of program. And I think that in a funny way, Lincoln Riley going to USC has been such a great thing for Kyle Whittingham because people tune in to see him kick their ass every single time. And so I think that was so I think that, like, I could see Kleiman having a Whittingham type jump is really, I think, what stands out to me. And by the way, let me double check. Chris Kleiman is number 13 overall on our rankings right now. Like I mentioned, I had him in my top 5. So some people a little lower, which fair enough. Number 3, this process has already started, but Dabo Swinney, like, if this thing is broken, it's going to get exposed. It's going to get very publicly exposed. It's funny. One thing that I think when you look back at the history of college football is there have been teams that have essentially benefited from, I don't want to just say like playing weak competition, but I think back to some of the like Penn State independent teams or the Miami independent teams, or there were years where the Big 8 wasn't all that and Nebraska and Oklahoma were able to take advantage, right? Well, so what you're able to do is kind of like not coast, but you're able to like not have to do too much before you're finally like playing the huge bowl game or the BCS national championship game or whatever it is. And Clemson sort of filled this role in the ACC for a number of years. They basically didn't have to try in the regular season, and they just had to win 1 or 2 games in order to win a national championship. This is a lot harder when you have to win 4 straight games against top 12 opponents, including, by the way, a potentially an ACC championship game. And I actually think that to kind of speak bigger picture about it, I think that the programs that are extremely good consistently, but maybe just short of elite, that's kind of a dangerous place to be in the expanded college football playoff, because you have a chance to lose. You have the chance to play a really hot 11 seed. And if you're not up for the challenge, you can get embarrassed on national television, right? Like, I mean, we think back even to bring up USC again.
Yeah,
they kind of have
game.
this.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. You have this inconsistent year, and like people are like, "Wow, that was really weird that you lost to Tulane," and that was pretty embarrassing. But I think that this is a whole nother level, right? If you're the 5 seed and you lose to the group of 5 team, and trust me, I'll get to them in a second, like that is like a disaster situation for a program like Clemson. And I think, again, like their quote unquote super down year last year, they technically went 9-4 because the ACC didn't really challenge it. But like if you go if you miss the playoffs, that's certainly not a great place to be. But also, if you make the playoffs near the end and get blasted, like I just think that hurts you reputationally in a way that, oh well, we only made the Mayo Bowl or whatever, just doesn't, I don't think, hit you reputationally the same way.
Yeah, I think he's definitely Dabo's going to be one of the coaches that's going to be negatively affected by this. I kind of try to classify him as just the game passing him by, which he, I'll be just like the kid from Spartanburg who will be the one who will galvanize the Tigers at this point. But when we saw that the schools with the least amount of transfers were the three service academies and Clemson, the fourth branch of the armed services, apparently, that was a fascinating one. It was right before we started recording this. There's a quote from, because ACC is having some of their events right now. Dabo was asked why Clemson did not sign any transfer portal players, and the quote he gave, this is where just kind of like you were leaning into this. Every player is technically a transfer. We just signed a whole class of guys transferring from high school. That is the coach of the Clemson Tigers. So, I mean, I just gotta say, I kind of want a talk show, or if they both decide to become commentators, I would pair him up with Deion Sanders, because they're both like willing to just be like, this is how I do things, this is who I am, and I'm gonna lean into it. I'm gonna spin. Like, they are two sides of the same coin in some ways, and just listening to what they say. But I'm not gonna stick just with Dabo, because I want to say my third selection in all of this are coaches I thought they're going to benefit from the 12-team playoff, because the thumb is on the scale pushing it in their direction. And the king of this is Marcus Freeman, only because Notre Dame helped design this system. Like, just to remind everybody, yes, Notre Dame doesn't have to play a conference title game, but they're going to have to they're going to have to play an extra playoff game no matter what. Or the reverse of that is, people are like, oh, Notre Dame could finish perfect and not finish in the top 4 seeds. Well, yeah, but they also don't have to play an extra game in all of this. But the system is stacked for them. And year one, particularly, Notre Dame's schedule is a little weaker than normal. Yes, they open at A&M, which will be a very interesting game. Mike Elko is a person I was debating about where he fits in this. I decided not to include him in my list. But then the rest of the schedule is surprisingly weak. Especially with a Florida State team that is reloading. And that's the only reason I'm saying that. Florida State would normally be a tough one. And then USC is, who knows, right? So I think Marcus Freeman, this opening season of the 12-team playoff, has an opportunity to perhaps, I don't want to say smoke and mirrors, because Notre Dame is going to be, he can coach, and he's got a talented team there, and he's got obviously some great, Denbrock's there. You've got a great new transfer quarterback. There's a lot of reasons to think that this is going to be a great team for the Irish, regardless of the schedule. But I think they're going to get an extra boost. And with the system, the way it's been designed, Notre Dame, I think Marcus Freeman is going to benefit from that, probably more than any other head coach, I think, in America heading into 2024.
No, he was right there at number 4 on my list as well. So good pick from you. The big thing, right, again, is you talk about a program that has won basically 9 or 10 games every single year. That is a playoff spot most of the time, right? Like that is going to be a playoff spot. You don't just talk about Notre Dame as being like, oh, well, they're like good, not great, right? Like I think that's been a lot of the conversation. And in the 4-team playoff especially, I think that it's been magnified that they don't really compete against the elite teams. Now, I think, again, the funny thing about the playoff in general is, I think, and expansion, I think you could throw into this too, is that the stratifications in college football are about to become even more precise. And I look at some of the programs that have traditionally been elite. I think that some of them might realize, like, hey, we are one of the greatest programs in the history of college football. We're one of the most moneyed programs in college football, but we're like the 9th of those and not like the 3rd of those. And like, you're going to feel it, right? You're going to actually feel the difference between some of these things. I mean, again, I think of a program like Penn State. One of the programs I'm most fascinated to watch is Oklahoma. Oklahoma has been a program that has so benefited from like the arrangements, and they've taken advantage. And I've said before, I think that Ohio State and Oklahoma are the 2 best run programs in college football. I think that those are 1 and 2. And like, okay, well, if you're the number 2 best run program in college football, but you're the 9th richest in a league where the 7 of the richest are ahead of you, how does that impact things. Well, I think that Notre Dame maybe has an opportunity to be on the right side of this in some ways, where it's like, hey, maybe we're the fifth, not just richest, but maybe we're like the fifth program in college football. And that means that we're going to win 2 playoff games. That's pretty solid. That's a good place to be. Notre Dame as well. One of the things they're going to benefit from a lot is, yes, they won't get a bye, but they have a chance to have a home playoff game almost every year. And that's going to be a super watched game. It's going to be a showcase for Notre Dame, obviously, as an institution. You're going to get a chance to beat a top 12 team. And then what happens from there happens. So I agree. I think that Notre Dame potentially could be a huge winner, and Marcus Freeman is somebody who could fly up the board.
If I could just say, I want to say Brent Venables is my SEC equivalent of James Franklin right now. A coach who I think is about to jump into a deep end with a lot of other good teams. There are only a couple of reasons why I would have maybe given Franklin the edge over that. Maybe it's a history that he's had at Penn State, but I think Oklahoma jumping into a pool with Alabama, with Georgia, with teams that can compete at a level that arguably is stronger by a lot of categories than the Big 12. Texas seems to be more ready, so therefore is Oklahoma the one that's been used to being one of the 2 big dogs that's suddenly going to find itself. Are we in the middle of the pack now? For those reasons you just said. So I'm glad you brought up Oklahoma.
And I don't want to like make this a whole Oklahoma thing, but like, okay, put aside the Texas win, right? Like put that aside just for a second. Last year, their next best win was like SMU, probably. I mean, it was not like they won 10 games. They all count. They won 10 games, but they had the easiest schedule by far in the conference. And so like, I just worry that 10 wins last year is a little bit of fool's gold. And if things are not to the level that they need to be, I especially look on the offensive line, where they're replacing all 5 starters after losing their offensive guard, Caden Green, to transfer to Missouri that nobody expected. It could get bad. Like I don't know that it will. They have the best offensive line coach in the country, but like, it's a lot, man. This is a lot to transition into this league with one of the toughest schedules in the league as well. I just am very curious to see how it goes. But anyway, who's your number 4?
My number 4, I decided to go with guys who were kind of almost about to break out, but now things just got a whole lot tougher, and I'm not sure their teams can jump and get over. And I had several guys in this category. I had Pat Narduzzi at Pitt. I had Justin Wilcox at Cal. But really, I think the one who's going to get the least out of this is Mark Stoops at Kentucky, because Kentucky felt like we're going to seriously become a football program now. They, well, I mean, set the whole basketball saga aside, but it seems like, wow, oh my gosh, like who benefited from this the most? Was it Mark Stoops? But at the same time, looking at the how tough I mean, I was literally just saying Oklahoma looks like they might have a tough time in the SEC. Kentucky, I'm not sure it's going to work. I think Kentucky's going to just find themselves falling a little bit. I'm not saying they're going to fall to the bottom. I'm not trying to say that at all about the Wildcats, but I think the hopes they had for being one of those teams that could occasionally, I'm not saying they're planning every year, but every couple of years make a real run at potentially being an at-large team, if not getting to the SEC title game, at the very least, becoming an at-large team has gotten a whole lot tougher. So I'm not sure the Wildcats have that ability to climb up. And Mark Stoops, for all that he's been building there, and he's been doing a lot of good, because Kentucky was just one of those teams where you're like, well, they're a basketball school, football is lesser. I think, unlike, funny enough, Lance Leipold at Kansas, where you think like, okay, no, I think Kansas could every now and again make that run. They have the potential there. I just don't know if I see that for what's going on with Kentucky heading into this.
No, I mean, let me make 2 points on this. One, I'm just going to run through CBS Sports spring SEC power rankings, right? So 1 Georgia, 2 Texas, 3 Ole Miss, 4 Alabama, 5 Missouri. That's a little bit of an unusual one. 6 Tennessee, 7 LSU, 8 Oklahoma, 9 is Kentucky, but then 10 is Texas A&M, 11 is Florida, 12 is Auburn. How many years in general will Kentucky be ahead of more than 2 of those programs heading forward?
Wow.
Right? Like, and that doesn't even count, like, what if Arkansas doesn't suck anymore? Right? Like, that's something you have to consider. At least they've had periods of success. And the other piece too, and I'll take most of the SEC East, and I'll take basically the entire Big Ten West and put them in this conversation. I think that being a nice team is going to be, in those leagues, less valuable than it's ever been. Like, nobody cares to the same extent as maybe they did before if you're South Carolina and you manage to get to 7, right? Like, nobody cares. Nobody's going to talk about you. Nobody cares. If you're Purdue, you're not going to have a pathway to get to the Big Ten title game at 8-6. That's not going to happen anymore. Nobody's going to care to the same extent. And it's one of the things actually that I hate the most about conference expansion is that we're in a position now where, like, the stratification is going to be insane. It's going to be absolutely ridiculous. And all of a sudden, like, does Minnesota have any pathway to a real kind of success? I don't know the answer to that. Does Vanderbilt, like, why even sponsor football anymore? What's the point? I don't know what you can even accomplish even in like a great year, right? Like, because it's just so tough. It's so hard. And like, just to make a bowl game, you have to schedule basically 4 gimmies if you're Vanderbilt, and then you have to beat 2 SEC teams. Like, maybe you hope you can get Mississippi State on the schedule or South Carolina on the schedule and that they have down years, but like, it is about to become less valuable than ever to be a striving lower tier program in the Big Ten or the SEC. Those 2 conferences are going to be about the 7 to 10 teams that feel like they can compete for a national championship, and everybody else is about to get pushed to the side.
I wonder if we're going to see a return to kind of the classic fandom where, for example, the Minnesota, like, well, if we beat Iowa, Wisconsin, we'll call it a good year. Kind of like, are we going to see a lot of those middle programs, the fan bases kind of corral around circle around those kinds of older views of where things would go? Or is it going to be impatience? And I'll be curious to see that. It'll be absolutely fascinating. Who's your next guy?
Yeah, to wrap up my number 5, I'm going to also bring together kind of a group. And I will say, so of course, like we mentioned, we have the rankings of the Power 5 coaches are all out right now, coming out on Thursday. Hopefully by the time that you are listening to this, will be our Group of 5 rankings. And this is the first time that we're actually doing a total Group of 5 rankings, all 66 Group of 5 coaches, which that was an adventure. I'll tell you what. You want to try to find the difference between Derek Mason and Thomas Hammock? Like, I had to go and do that. It was a lot of fun. So I'll quickly, this isn't out as yet, so you might be hearing this a little, we might be jumping the gun, but I think it's okay. Number 1, Jamie Chadwell at Liberty. Number 2, John Sumrall at Tulane. Number 3, Jeff Traylor at UTSA. Number 4, Jeff Tedford at Fresno State. And number 5, Troy Calhoun at Air Force. So Tedford's an older coach, right? Like, he had a successful run in the power conferences and then came back. These other 4 coaches essentially have always been passed over for opportunities. Jeff Traylor had a chance to be Texas Tech's head coach and actually kind of decided that he wasn't done at UTSA. So like, his is a little bit of a unique situation, but I remember too, whenever he was brought up to be Texas A&M's head coach, what the reaction was. It was not positive whatsoever. Like, which was crazy to me. I mean, this is one of the most successful coaches in the country. The fact that John Sumrall is not right now a head coach in the power conferences, and that he had to leave to take a job in the American instead of in the Sun Belt. That's crazy to me. I'll run through real quick with mine. My only difference was that I had Sean Lewis at number 5 and Jeff Tedford at 6. So that was my only real difference. And that's another coach who had been overlooked, of course. All this to say, I think the idea of the Group of 5 coach growing and developing to a point that he gets plucked away by a really good program, it's kind of going away in some ways. But I think that the playoff actually could have a really positive impact on that. And the reason that I say that is to go back to the NCAA tournament analogy. If you are a mid-major coach and you make the tournament and have a good showing, that's sometimes enough. That's sometimes enough to get noticed by the big boys. If you pull an upset, right? If you go on like a Cinderella run in the college football playoff is probably going to be winning one game. But if you win that one game, I mean, that could be enough to get you a job. If you're Jamie Chadwell, who, again, it is absolutely insane to me that he isn't a head coach right now in the power conferences. If you're Jamie Chadwell and people are like, well, what does he know about winning at a high level? What does he know about coaching at this kind of program? He's never coached in the SEC. He's never coached at a power conference. And you go and you beat the 5 seed, people are going to notice you, man. Like, people are going to notice. John Summerall, Jeff Traylor, Troy Calhoun. I mean, so many good coaches who have a chance to make this field and get some attention. I mean, it's even like, for comparison, we had like 6 weeks of watching Sean Lewis actually coach offense, and people were like, wow, he's really good at this. That's crazy. And he ended up getting one of the elite group of 5 jobs at San Diego State and was considered by a couple places for power conference jobs as well. Like, I think that there's going to be more attention paid. And I'll even say, like, the fact that we're doing at CBS this group of 5 rankings is, in fact, a compliment to what the playoff is bringing and the attention it's bringing to the group of 5. I don't know if we would have done this if the group of 5 team wouldn't necessarily be in the college football playoff. You know, there's been a rumor, of course, of a potential top 25 poll of group of 5 teams. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to be a net positive, but I do think it's going to bring more attention to group of 5 programs because they will be competing for that college football playoff spot and people will watch that game. So ultimately, I think that this has a chance to be a huge benefit for a group of 5 coaches.
Yeah, I think that's a great group of coaches. The only one I would have thrown in there, Jeff Tedford, I'm only a little worried because of the health things that kind of hit him at the end of last season. Like, I don't know, like, are we in the Jerry Kill zone where we don't know how long he's going to be there or if he needs to take a break? Jason Candle would have been one I would have thrown in there, but he's like the ultimate underrated coach. Like, how is he not moving anywhere? Why is he still at Toledo?
I have some very quick, very slight Jason Candle takes, which is that Toledo is the most advantaged program in the MAC, and I don't think he's won consistently enough for me to feel super excited about him. Now, again, this is like nitpicking, and if somebody asked me, hey, if we hired Jason Candle, would that be a good hire? I think it would be, but I view him a little bit as taking over a system that was already in place and not always elevating it to the level that I feel like it should be elevated to.
You know, one of the things that this discussion just kind of got me thinking of is watching Summerall have to make that move to Tulane rather than a P5 program. I was thinking of some of the other moves. We've seen obviously a couple of G5 coordinators that went to go be head coaches. G5 head coaches that went to go be coordinators at Alabama. We saw North Dakota State's head coach go and become the linebacker coach at USC. I mean, we've been seeing some of this, so I do wonder if the playoff is just simply changing and altering how we view the vector towards getting a job. Just like the NFL kind of started to get less and less interested in hiring college head coaches. As these sports and as they evolve, we see where they go. But I want to go ahead and wrap up my group. My number 5 is similar to Marcus Freeman, and that's Mike Norvell, because he's already a good coach. We've seen what he can do, especially if you give him time to develop either both bring people in and via the portal, but as well as using what was already there. And it's kind of a funny caveat. If the Noles stay in the ACC, I think Florida State is in a particular position to give their head coach an opportunity to look even better, perhaps, than he already is. Because if they can just continuously win, they will be absolutely, almost certainly, one of the 4 seeds. And certainly a highly ranked team year after year, and even perhaps coming in second place, they'll absolutely have an opportunity to get into the playoff year after year and be a team that will be threatening, not a team that anyone will want to face. Florida State still has both a historical cachet, but also recent history of the ability to be a challenger that is difficult. So this season is a little bit of a rebuild, but we've seen what he can do. But the season is actually not terrible. The schedule isn't terrible. We'll see if they become the Irish national champs against Georgia Tech and Dublin and then go from there. Maybe they'll do better than the last Irish national champs, because Northwestern ends up, that's all you can really do in a given year. The luck of the Irish for them. But I think with Clemson is going to be a tough one, but the rest of their schedule, Notre Dame, I mean, really, that's really the fun part, is they get to play Notre Dame and Miami and all of those teams. But I'm going to just say Mike Norvell, if we can look at just the next 5 years, they're going to get the most advantage out of this, I think.
Yeah, I will just quickly mention my last place group of 5 coach, Trent Dilfer at UAB. What is going on over there? Anyway, I think that Mike Norvell is a good choice for this. And I think in some ways, he gets to be the positive version of what we describe with Dabo Swinney, right? Like where like there's a manageable path, and so it's going to be, can you build up a roster that's able to withstand the actual playoff once you get into it? And I have a lot of faith in what we've seen so far from Mike Norvell, also a former Group of Five coach, by the way, at Memphis. He, of course, from a development perspective, has a track record. They've used the portal in a really smart way. Florida State, of course, not a blue blood program, but sort of a, in some ways, a new blood program, I guess you could call it, with what they did over the past 20 or 30 years, especially winning a couple of national championships, actually. And so they're kind of like the one close to elite level program that's hit the portal in a very unique kind of way. So I think that they've found a good balance of how to do things. They've developed talent. They've put guys into the NFL. I love the fact that they've retained talent as well, that they've convinced guys like Jared Verse to come back for another year like they did last year. So I like what they're doing. I think that they are the team from the ACC that has a chance to step up and kind of be that league signature program and have a chance to make the field, like you said, no matter if they finish number 1 or number 2 in the conference.
Absolutely. I think that's a great pick. I just wanted to go ahead and let's wrap this up. I think it's been a nice conversation about who all these coaches are and who we think is going to be valuable. I want to encourage all of you to read the coaching rankings that they have at CBSSports.com. It's several articles, by several writers, but ranking the top 25 Power 4 coaches. And again, by the time you're hearing this, they'll have the G5 coach rankings, and I'm absolutely looking forward to that, especially the bottom. I don't know why. I'm always fascinated by who gets ranked at the bottom because I know who the top G5 coaches are. I mean, I think even at the outset of this show, I named 5 guys and you actually named, I think, 4 of them. So, I mean, I'm not going to be surprised by those, but I'm very curious to see. And Dilfer, I could see him being at the bottom, but I could think of some other candidates as well. It's going to be exciting times. Can't wait. It'll be a fun read. Well, want to thank all of you for listening. I want to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti, for doing everything he does behind the scenes and helping us out here. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. You can find his work at CBSSports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Kyeri. I'm part of the team that runs Reddit CFB. Thanks for joining us. Have a good one.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.